Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, we always say we're diving deep, but today I think we're going spelunking.
Spelunking, huh? Going underground. I like it.
Yeah, because this time we're cracking open one of those books that, well, let's just say they've gotten a bit of a reputation.
A reputation for sure. But like we always do here, we're not here to just trade in scary stories.
Right, we're here to get past the rumors and really understand what makes these books tick, what makes them so powerful even after centuries. So, for episode 135, get ready for Hermes Unveiled, the lost teachings of Egypt's divine mind.
We're talking ancient wisdom, esoteric knowledge, and a figure so shrouded in myth and legend that just saying his name, Hermes Trismegistus, feels like stepping into another world.
Feels like it, right. And to guide us on this journey, our main source is going to be G.R.S. Mead's Thrice-Greatest Hermes. It's considered one of the definitive works on the subject.
Mead really tried to get to the heart of the Hermetic tradition, to understand its historical context and the core ideas that make it so enduring.
Okay, so let's just start with the basics. Hermes Trismegistus. It's a name that even people who haven't delved into this stuff have probably heard before. But what does it actually represent? Is it a person, a title, a concept?
Well, it's kind of all those things. You see, Hermes Trismegistus is this figure who's both a legendary wise man, a sage of ancient Egypt, and the supposed author of a whole bunch of really important texts.
Right, so it's like the name itself carries this weight of both a person and a whole body of knowledge.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is how seriously these writings were taken by thinkers throughout history. We're talking early church fathers, Renaissance humanists, all these big names considered the Trismegistic text to be incredibly ancient.
Ancient, like on par with scripture?
Oh, even more so, some thought. They put Hermes way back there, with figures like Enoch and Noah, possibly even before Moses.
Wow, so they're looking at this as a direct line to some kind of primal wisdom?
Right. It was seen as a source of profound spiritual and philosophical knowledge that predated many of the major religious and philosophical systems. And you can imagine how that kind of thinking shaped the way people viewed the world.
But then, as often happens with history, things get a bit more complicated. Later scholars started looking at these texts, particularly the one called Pomandris, with a more critical eye, and they started using this term pseudepigraphs.
Yeah, and that term basically means that the texts were falsely attributed to an earlier author. Basically, it was like saying, hey, Hermes might not have actually written these.
So instead of being these ancient, almost prehistorical texts, some scholars started to think they might have actually been written much later.
Exactly, and some even proposed that they might have had Christian or semi-Christian origins, which really threw a wrench into things, because up until then, these texts were seen as potentially validating certain Christian beliefs.
So if they were influenced by Christianity, they couldn't really be used to support it, right?
That's the big issue. It flipped the whole narrative on its head.
Okay, so where do things stand today? Is there consensus on when and where these texts actually came from?
Not quite a full consensus, no. But there were some really interesting perspectives out there. Mead, for example, he's not buying the whole forgery idea. He sees these texts as authentic expressions of a specific time and place.
Okay, so he believes they're genuine products of some ancient intellectual movement.
Yeah, and he connects them strongly to the wisdom traditions of ancient Egypt. He even suggests they could be a key to understanding Egyptian thought, and that they represent a form of what he calls archaic gnosis.
Archaic gnosis, so a really early form of spiritual insight.
Right, and that's a big part of what makes these texts so intriguing. They give us a window into a way of thinking about the divine and the cosmos that's different from anything we see in more mainstream religious or philosophical systems.
So we have these texts, but they didn't just appear out of thin air, right? How did they actually come down to us? Did someone find them in a hidden library or something?
It's more of a detective story than that. Mead talks about all these different compilations and translations that have happened over the centuries. He really highlights Louis Menard's French translation from the 1800s. He calls it particularly insightful and sensitive to the nuances of the material.
Okay, so even getting to the meaning of these texts can be a challenge because of the translation issues.
It is. It is. You have to be really careful about which translation you're using. You also have later English translations, some based on Menard's work, some trying to be more literal, like Kingsford and Maitland and J.D. Chambers' translation of Pomandres, for example.
So even for someone who's really interested in this stuff, just getting your hands on a reliable version of these texts can be a whole project in itself.
It really can. And then there's the question of the manuscripts themselves. What kind of shape are they in?
Oh, right. Are we talking crumbling scrolls or beautifully preserved texts. What's the story there?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Mead actually describes the textual tradition as extraordinarily bad in a lot of ways.
Extraordinarily bad. That doesn't sound promising.
It means that there are inconsistencies, variations, and all sorts of things that make it tricky to figure out the most accurate version. But here's the weird part. It's also pretty uniform when it comes to the core content.
Okay, so while the specific wording might be messed up in places, the main ideas are consistent.
Exactly. And that's what allows scholars to trace these texts back to people like Michael Psellus, who was a Byzantine scholar in the 11th century. So even though we might not have the most pristine copies, the central ideas seem to have survived the journey.
Okay, so despite all these challenges with the texts themselves, we can still get a sense of the main themes and ideas. And Mead gives us a few hints based on the chapter titles and excerpts. What jumps out at you as the most important things for someone to understand about this Hermetic tradition?
Well, first and foremost, you can't ignore the connection to ancient Egypt. I mean, it's right there in the title of this deep dive. These texts claim to embody aspects of that ancient Egyptian wisdom.
Right, they're not shying away from that lineage at all.
And then there's the whole question of how these ideas might relate to early Christianity. I mean, we talked about how scholars were initially thinking these texts were super old and might even support Christian ideas. But then, when they realized they might actually be from a later period, that whole relationship became much more complicated.
Yeah, it's like suddenly you're looking at a potential influence rather than a confirmation.
Precisely.
Mhm.
And for anyone interested in early Christian history, understanding how those two worlds might have intersected is a huge deal.
Okay, so we've got the Egyptian connection and the possible relationship to early Christianity. What else?
Well, Mead also points out all these references to mystery traditions. It's like these texts are hinting at secret knowledge, special practices, initiations, that kind of thing.
Right, like they're part of a hidden world of spiritual knowledge.
Exactly. And that ties in with the whole archaic gnosis concept, which is a big part of what Mead is trying to uncover. He sees these texts as pointing to a very early form of spiritual understanding, something that might even predate some of the more organized religions.
Okay, and finally, there's this whole debate about polytheism versus Neoplatonism, especially in those Byzantine manuscripts.
Right, and that really gets to the heart of some of the internal tensions within these texts.
Mhm.
You have some parts that seem to reflect a traditional polytheistic worldview.
Okay, so belief in multiple gods.
Yeah. And then you have other parts that are more aligned with Neoplatonism, which is this more philosophical, unified view of the divine. And in some cases, they even seem to be trying to reconcile those ideas with Christian beliefs.
So it's like they're wrestling with some really big questions about the nature of God and the cosmos.
They are. And for anyone trying to understand these texts, recognizing that internal diversity is crucial.
Okay, so let's talk about Thoth for a second, because you can't really dive into Hermes without talking about Thoth. He's basically the Egyptian god who Hermes is identified with, right?
Exactly. Thoth is like the OG when it comes to wisdom and knowledge in the Egyptian pantheon. Writing, magic, measuring time, he's the master of it all.
Right, so if you were going to pick an Egyptian god to be the equivalent of Hermes, Thoth would be the obvious choice.
Absolutely. And Mead goes into the etymology of his name, Tati, connecting it to T, which was an old name for the ibis.
The ibis, that bird you always see with Thoth?
That's the one. The ibis was probably chosen as a symbol because of its perceived wisdom, maybe its connection to the Nile. But Mead, he takes it a step further, of course.
Oh, he always does. What's his take on the ibis?
He says we shouldn't just see it as a literal bird. He wants us to think of it as a great bird of the cosmic depths, a symbol of something deeper and more profound.
Okay, so instead of reducing the logos, that divine reason we've talked about, to a regular bird, he's elevating the ibis to something more cosmic.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that these ancient symbols often have layers of meaning. It's not always about the literal interpretation.
Now, one of the most striking symbols Mead talks about is the net. Can you explain that one for us?
The net is this idea of fate, this web that kind of traps ordinary people, keeps them bound to the material world and all its limitations.
Right, it's like being caught in a web, unable to break free.
But here's the twist. Mead says that those who achieve the mind, that higher spiritual intellect, they can actually turn the net around.
Turn it around. How do you do that?
They use their understanding to essentially catch food from a higher source. So instead of being limited by fate, They use it to their advantage.
Wow, so it's like they're no longer at the mercy of fate, but they're using their knowledge to draw sustenance from something beyond it.
Exactly. And Mead connects this to that biblical idea of being fishers of men, which I think is a pretty powerful parallel.
It is. He also links it to those Orphic ideas of the veil and the net, and even to the veil of Isis. It's like this idea of being veiled or trapped is a pretty common theme in these ancient traditions.
It is. Think about it. The veil of Isis is this thing that separates the divine from the mundane. And no one, no mortal or even dead person has ever lifted it. It's this ultimate mystery, the hidden spiritual nature that we can only really access when we transcend our limitations.
And the net is kind of like a representation of those limitations, right?
Exactly. It's the thing that binds us to our ordinary way of seeing the world. And until we can break free from that net, we're trapped in that limited perception.
Another big idea that Mead talks about is the religion of the light. That sounds pretty intense.
It is. Basically, he's saying that for the ancient Egyptians and within this Hermetic tradition, spiritual enlightenment, illumination, that was the whole point. The religion of Egypt wasn't just about rituals and ceremonies. It was about seeking that light, that true understanding.
Okay, so it's like their whole religious system was geared towards achieving this state of illumination.
Exactly. And it wasn't just an intellectual pursuit. It was about connecting with the divine, becoming one with the light.
And that connects to the idea of the fatherhood of God that Mead talks about. He mentions that the Egyptians had this really interesting view of death.
They did. They saw it as a reunion with this loving, paternal God, a chance to merge with the Logos.
Wow, so they weren't afraid of death in the same way that some other cultures were.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It was seen as a homecoming, a joyful return to the source.
Now, Mead also introduces this really mysterious text called The Book of the Master of the Secret House. I mean, the name itself sounds like something straight out of a Dan Brown novel.
It does. And Mead describes it as a scroll containing the greatest of mysteries, instructing in light and life.
Okay, so it's not your typical self-help book.
Definitely not. He suggests it was used in 3 different ways throughout Egyptian history. First, it was for direct instruction, teaching people while they were alive. Then they started reciting chapters over the dead to help them on their journey in the afterlife.
Wow, so it's like a guidebook for the soul.
Exactly. And then, even later, they started burying fragments of it with mummies as talismans. It's like the meaning might have gotten lost over time, but they still saw it as having this powerful magic.
It's fascinating how the way a text is used can evolve like that. And speaking of spiritual journeys, Mead mentions the twice-born initiate. What's that all about?
Oh, that's a key concept in a lot of mystical traditions. It basically means that someone has undergone a radical transformation, a spiritual rebirth.
Okay, so it's not just about being physically born, it's about being reborn into a higher state of being.
Exactly. The twice-born initiate has gone through purification, received illumination, and they've transcended their old weaknesses. They're no longer bound by their lower nature. They're empowered, clothed in light.
That's a pretty powerful image.
Hmm.
And finally, in this section, Mead talks about these invocations to Hermes. They describe him as the creator, the self-begotten God, the one who orders night and day. It's like he's being elevated to a cosmic level.
He is. And what's really interesting is that the praise is coming from everyone, not just humans. Gods, angels, daimons, they're all acknowledging his power and authority.
It's like he's this universally revered figure standing at the center of everything.
Exactly. And it really shows you how highly regarded Hermes was within this tradition. He's not just a wise teacher. He's a divine being, intimately involved in the creation and ordering of the cosmos.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, Mead explores some of the potential connections between Hermetic writings and other ancient systems of thought. He mentions Gnostic sects and even Hellenic Jews like Philo of Alexandria. What's the link there?
It's all about tracing the flow of ideas. Mead thinks that the Hermetic writings, particularly those that focus on figures like the Shepherd of Men, might be a bridge between those early Gnostic groups and the thought of someone like Philo.
Okay, so they're sharing some common ground.
Exactly. And he even suggests that they might help us understand some of the differences between those earlier Gospels in the New Testament and the Gospel of John.
Wow, so they could shed light on how those different Christian texts came to be.
Potentially. He sees a lot of similarities between the way the fourth Gospel talks about the Logos and how it's discussed in Hermetic literature.
Okay, so maybe they were both influenced by the same kind of thinking that was happening in those Alexandrian Gnostic circles.
That's what Mead suggests. But he's also careful to point out that the Logos was a big deal in Hellenistic theology more broadly. So it's not like The Hermetic texts were the only source of those ideas.
Right. It's all part of a bigger intellectual web. Now, Mead spends some time on the title Thrice-Greatest Hermes. It's a pretty impressive title. When do we first see it pop up in the historical record?
It's first mentioned in connection with the writings of Manetho. He was an Egyptian priest and historian writing during the Hellenistic period.
Okay, so we're talking a few centuries before the Common Era.
Right. And Manetho links the first Hermes to the good spirit, the Agaphadaimon, and then identifies a second Hermes, the father of Tat, as thrice greatest.
So there's a lineage here. It's not just one Hermes.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And then you have Griffith, who proposed this whole mathematical interpretation of the title.
Oh, that sounds interesting. Tell me more.
Well, he thought the epithet thrice greatest might have been derived mathematically. He connected the single great to a base unit, then great and great, to a later title of Thoth, and then thrice greatest to a combination or even a cube of that concept.
Yeah.
It's pretty complex stuff, but he even tries to tie it to the symbolism of Thoth's city, the eighth.
Wow, so he's seeing this really deep symbolic meaning baked into the title.
He is, and it shows you just how much thought and symbolism went into these ancient traditions.
Okay, and then finally in this section, Mead talks about the Stelae of Hermes, also called the Stelae of Seth. These were these ancient monuments that supposedly held all this incredible wisdom.
Right, and figures like Pythagoras and Plato were said to have learned from them.
Wow, so we're talking about some seriously influential figures.
We are. And the idea is that these stelae were inscribed with this ancient knowledge, and they were carefully guarded by a select group known as the Sons of Seth.
The Sons of Seth, that's a pretty loaded name.
It is. It connects to all sorts of ideas about secret lineages of wisdom being passed down through history. And there's even a story about them preserving this knowledge because they knew a big cosmic destruction was coming.
So they were like the keepers of the flame, making sure this wisdom wouldn't be lost.
Exactly. And it adds another layer to this whole idea of a hidden tradition of knowledge that's being passed down through the ages.
Now, moving along, Mead talks about something called the man doctrine, and he introduces this concept of the heavenly man, the anthropos, from Parmenides.
Ah, the anthropos, that's a big one. It's basically this idea of a spiritual prototype of humanity, this primordial being that has all the divine powers.
Okay, so like the original human blueprint, but on a spiritual level.
Exactly. And this anthropos descends into the material world and gets all tangled up in fate and all that messy stuff.
Right, so it's like this fall from grace, but on a cosmic scale.
Precisely. And what's really interesting is that you see similar ideas in those early Christian Gnostic systems. They had their own version of the heavenly man.
So again, we're seeing these connections between different traditions.
We are. And Mead traces this idea back even further, using Hippolytus's analysis of a Nicene text. Hippolytus was this early Christian writer who was really interested in refuting heresies.
Okay, so not exactly a fan of the Gnostics.
Not really. But his work is super valuable because it gives us insight into what those early Gnostic groups actually believed. And what's interesting is that his analysis suggests that this man doctrine wasn't just a Christian thing. It might have roots in even earlier Hellenistic thought.
So once again, we're pushing the origins of these ideas further and further back.
We are. It's like peeling back layers of history.
And then there's the whole Nicene view of the soul. They really struggled with understanding where the soul came from and what it truly was.
They did. I mean, it's a huge question, right? Where does consciousness come from? Is it something pre-existing? Does it create itself? Or does it emerge from some kind of cosmic chaos?
Those are some pretty big questions to wrestle with.
They are. And the fact that they were debating these things shows you just how deep they were going in their exploration of the human condition.
Mead also looks at how the Essenes interpreted biblical figures and stories, relating them to their own cosmology and this idea of spiritual birth. They even talked about Egypt as a body and Jesus as turning some kind of cosmic stream upwards.
Yeah, they were all about finding symbolic meaning. It's like they were looking at these figures and stories as representations of deeper spiritual principles.
So it's not just a literal reading of the Bible, it's about finding hidden meanings.
Exactly. And this leads them to connect with other mystery traditions, like those of the Samothracians. They also have this idea of Adam as the original man.
So again, we're seeing this archetype of the primordial human pop up all over the place.
It's a powerful image, right? This idea that we all come from this perfect divine source and that our journey is about returning to that state.
And Mead connects it to all these other traditions, from Phrygia to Athens, and he talks about their symbolism related to creation, death, and rebirth, initiation, all those big themes.
He's painting a picture of this vast network of interconnected ideas, a shared language of symbolism and mystical experience that was woven throughout the ancient world.
It's amazing to think about how these ideas were traveling and evolving across different cultures. Now, Mead puts a lot of emphasis on Philo of Alexandria and his importance for understanding the Hermetic texts. They both come out of this Hellenistic theological world,
They
right?
do, and Philo is especially helpful when it comes to understanding that whole logos concept. He was a Jewish philosopher who really grappled with the idea of divine reason and how it mediated between God and the created world.
And Mead sees a lot of parallels between Philo's thinking about the logos and what we see in the Hermetic writings.
Tons of parallels. They're both trying to make sense of this idea of a divine force that shapes and orders the universe, and they're both drawing on that broader Hellenistic philosophical tradition.
And Philo's method was all about allegorical interpretation. He was taking those Jewish myths and finding deeper meanings within them, using Hellenistic philosophy as a kind of lens.
Exactly. He was like a translator, bridging those two worlds of thought.
And Mead also points out that Philo was big on secrecy when it came to mystical knowledge. He talked about the ineffable mysteries, those things that are too sacred to be spoken about directly.
Right, and that's a key element of those ancient mystery traditions. It's not knowledge for everyone, it's for those who have been properly initiated, who are ready to receive it.
Okay, so there's a sense of responsibility, a recognition that some knowledge is too powerful to just be thrown around carelessly.
Absolutely. And then finally, with Philo, Mead gets into his concept of God as this being beyond creation, and he talks about the Logos as the firstborn son, the eldest angel, the instrument of creation. He even mentions the ladder from earth to heaven, and the idea of man is the image of the divine, with the Logos being the seal that makes that connection.
Wow, it's a really intricate and beautiful way of thinking about the relationship between God, the cosmos, and humanity.
It is, and it shows you how deeply these ideas were being explored in that Hellenistic world.
Okay, so let's shift our focus to Plutarch now. Mead brings him in as this Greek intellectual who's really grappling with Egyptian religious ideas, particularly in his book on Isis and Osiris.
Plutarch is a great example of that cross-cultural exchange that was happening in that period. He's not just dismissing Egyptian beliefs as some kind of primitive superstition. He's trying to understand them, to find the deeper meaning within them.
Right, and on Isis and Osiris is a really important source for us because it gives us a glimpse into how those Egyptian myths and rituals were being interpreted by someone outside of that tradition.
Exactly. And Mead highlights all sorts of fascinating details from that book. He talks about the practices of the Egyptian priests, their dietary restrictions, their purification rituals, their elaborate cosmology with all those gods and goddesses, Rhea, Kronos, Helios, Selene, Osiris, Isis, Typhon, Nephthys.
It's a whole world of mythology.
It is. And even Hermes pops up in there, helping to create those extra 5 days in the Egyptian calendar.
Okay, so we're seeing him woven into the fabric of their myths.
Exactly. And then Plutarch goes into all those interpretations of the gods. Osiris is water and the Logos, Isis is earth, Typhon is the sea, and chaos, Horus is the cosmos. It's a really rich symbolic language.
Right, it's like they're using these deities to represent different forces and principles within the universe.
Exactly. And he talks about the symbolism of the sistrum, this musical instrument that was used in Egyptian rituals, and he explains the role of daimons as these intermediary beings between the gods and humans.
Timu, so we're seeing that Greek philosophical influence creeping in.
We are. It's a reminder that these ideas were constantly interacting and influencing each other.
And Mead points out that there were all these different ways of interpreting the Osiris myth. Some people saw it as a moral allegory, others as a story about the cycles of nature, others as an astronomical allegory.
It shows you that these myths weren't just fixed stories. They were open to interpretation, and they could be used to explain different aspects of reality.
And he talks about how the Egyptians venerated animals, sometimes for practical reasons, sometimes because they saw those animals as embodying divine powers.
Right, so it's not just about worshiping animals for the sake of it. It's about recognizing the divine within nature, seeing those animals as reflections of something higher.
Okay, so there's a deeper symbolic meaning at play.
Exactly. And Mead even touches on their use of geometrical symbolism, how they associated different shapes with different deities.
Oh, like sacred geometry.
Exactly. The equilateral triangle was associated with Athena, the number 1 with Apollo, 2 with strife, 3 with justice. It's all about finding those deeper connections between mathematical principles and divine forces.
And of course, there's the whole element of secrecy surrounding certain sacred objects related to Isis and Osiris.
Oh yeah, the Egyptians were big on keeping some things hidden, reserving certain knowledge for those who were initiated into the mysteries.
Okay, so it's not for the uninitiated.
Exactly. And finally, with Plutarch, Mead talks about the identification of Osiris with Hades and Pluto, those Greek and Roman gods of the underworld.
So once again, we're seeing this blending of different traditions.
We are. And it shows you how fluid these ideas could be, how they could travel and transform across cultural boundaries.
Now, Mead brings us back to the Pomandres and suggests that it might actually be a revised version of an earlier text. It's
Yeah.
like those ancient manuscripts are constantly being rewritten and reinterpreted.
They are. It makes you wonder what those earlier versions might have looked like, what kinds of ideas might have been added or changed over time.
Right, like we're only seeing a snapshot of a much longer and more complex process.
Exactly. And Mead highlights Reichenstein's theory, which proposes that the Christian writer of Hermes might have had access to a more complete version of Pomandres. It's like a literary treasure hunt, trying to piece together these lost texts.
It's fascinating. And he connects the ideas in Pomandres to those popular cults of the time, pointing to prayers in the magic papyri that talk about the mind as the shepherd and the revealer of light.
It shows you how these philosophical ideas weren't just confined to elite circles. They were filtering down into popular religious practice, influencing how people connected with the divine on a daily basis.
Right, so it's not just abstract theory, it's lived experience.
Exactly. And then Mead throws in this really interesting story about Abbot Olympius.
Oh, what's that one about?
Well, Olympius was this Christian abbot, and he had this encounter with a pagan priest who was watching how the monks lived. And the priest was amazed because he said that his own tradition had always taught about the importance of direct mystical experience, and he saw the monks as actually living it out.
Wow, so even though they came from different religious backgrounds, they recognized a shared pursuit of something deeper.
They did. And it suggests that those ancient mystery traditions might have had more in common with early Christian monasticism than we might think.
That's a pretty radical idea.
Right.
Now, Mead gets into some pretty heavy-duty cosmology when he introduces that Seppian Gnostic creation myth from Hippolytus.
Yeah, that one's a trip. It talks about light, darkness, and pure spirit, and it describes the spirit as this subtle fragrance that's sowing the seeds of light into the lower realms.
Wow, it's a really poetic and evocative way of describing creation.
It is. And it shows you just how diverse those Gnostic creation myths could be. They weren't just rehashing the same old stories. They were coming up with their own unique explanations for how the universe came to be.
And then there's the concept of the eon, which gets connected to all sorts of things, from mystery rites to the Christ mystery to the monad and Pythagorean thought.
The eon is a tricky one, but basically it's this emanation or powder of God that plays a huge role in a lot of Hellenistic thought. It's often associated with divine will, cosmic order, and the journey of the soul.
Okay, so it's a pretty big deal concept.
It is, and the fact that it pops up in all these different systems, from Gnosticism to mystery religions to Pythagoreanism, shows you how interconnected those different strands of thought were.
Right, like they're all drawing from a shared well of ideas. Now, Mead finally gets to the whole question of reincarnation and the soul's journey, and he points out something really interesting. Hermes specifically says that human souls don't go back into animal bodies.
Yeah, and that's different from what some other thinkers, like Plato, believed. Plato was open to the idea of transmigration between human and animal forms. But Hermes is drawing a clear line.
Okay, so he's saying that the human soul has a unique destiny, that it doesn't just bounce around between different forms of life.
Exactly. And then Mead brings in Plato's vision of as a kind of parallel to those Hermetic teachings about what happens to the soul after death.
Right? That famous story about dying in battle and then coming back to life to tell everyone about what he saw in the afterlife.
That's the one. And it's full of all these fascinating details about the soul's journey, the different realms it passes through, the choices it has to make.
And Mead also mentions Plutarch's vision of Aridaeus, which is a similar kind of afterlife narrative. It's like these stories were a way for people to explore the mysteries of death and what might lie beyond.
They were. And they often included these really vivid descriptions of the soul's experiences, its encounters with different beings, its judgment, its ultimate destination.
Right, like a roadmap for the soul.
Exactly. And Mead connects all this back to the diagram of the Ophites, this Gnostic system that describes the 7 spheres of the lower psychic nature, each one named after an animal.
So again, we're seeing that connection between the soul's journey and the animal world, even though Hermes said that human souls don't go back into animal bodies.
It's a bit of a paradox, right? But it shows you how those ancient thinkers were grappling with these complex ideas, trying to make sense of the relationship between the human and the animal, the material and the spiritual.
And then there's the astral crater of Father Liber from Macrobius, which symbolizes the descent of souls into the material world.
Right, and it's connected to this idea of the draught of oblivion that you see in some traditions. The soul drinks from this cup and forgets its past lives before being reborn.
It's like a cosmic reset button.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder what the purpose of that forgetting might be. Is it to protect us from the pain of past lives? Or is it to allow us to fully embrace each new incarnation without the baggage of the past?
Big questions. Okay, so
Yeah.
as we wrap things up, Mead really emphasizes this image of Hermes as a teacher, a revealer of wisdom. He compares him to Imhotep Asclepius, who was this Egyptian god of healing and wisdom.